premiere episode of This Is Not My Job. I am your host, Carl Mizell. Thank you so much for joining me today, whenever today is for you, such as the beauty of podcasts. They are both portable and on demand. My guest today is a good friend of mine and a prolific multihyphenate, Jono Diener. He's a musician. He is a writer. He is also an entrepreneur. A couple of his friends recently started a coffee company in Flint, Michigan. And we're going to touch on all of that in a very sprawling but tight, compact conversation. And he's always a very funny person and a very thoughtful and insightful person at the same time. So when I conceived of this idea for the podcast, he was right there at the top of the list for people that I wanted to have on the show. And speaking of the show, I'd like to, every episode I think for the time being, I'm going to have intros just to kind of, say hello, check in, see how you're doing. But this time, with this being the first episode, I kind of wanted to establish what the show is about for you. And in its simplest terms, I will be talking to creators or creatives. We use the term creative to just indicate or, identify people who make things, not necessarily artists, actors, writers and whatnot, but anybody who makes anything in addition to holding down a day job while they make those things. Thanks, Dan. It's my cat, Dan. Those are the people that I want to talk to because I want people to better understand the realities for creatives in this world, because few and far between are the people who are fortunate enough to be able to make creating their career. For the bulk of us, it's a combination of a day job, and when you have the time beyond your job and your other responsibilities, making the things that make you happy. Because I also want to sort of tear down that myth of the starving artist, because I've done a lot of things, creatively speaking, over the course of my adult life. I've been a comedian, a musician, an actor, a writer, a director, a podcast host. But throughout all of that, I have always held down a job. And I feel like there's a lot of confusion or a lack of understanding from people who aren't necessarily involved in those creative fields. They think that, that either if you're a musician, that's all you do. That's how you make your money. Or they think that you're just broke all the time and, not quote unquote contributing to society, because that vague metric is how people gauge your value in the capitalist hellscape that we live in. And that just isn't the case. So I wanted to sort of break down those barriers and give people a better understanding of how that works. But conversely, I also want to use this platform as an opportunity for creatives to give their advice to anyone who is sort of dipping their toes into the waters of this dual existence of having a job, but also wanting to be a creator. And at some point, I would also like to, there will be people on the show whose career is creating. Maybe they were doing both. They were holding down a job and they finally decided to cross that threshold and commit full time to creating. And I think there's a lot of value in talking to those people as well, because they can lend a lot of insight into the process and kind of overcoming any obstacles or roadblocks that you might not be able to see before you make that leap. Or maybe you don't, maybe you think you want to make that leap, but then you hear those conversations and decide, maybe that's not for me, or maybe that is for me, but just not right now. So I hope that in addition to a few laughs along the way and a few interruptions from my toddler son, because that's life in the pandemic, is just your family is always on top of you. So depending on how the editing goes, for every episode, you will, in all likelihood, you'll hear my child, you'll hear my dog, you might hear my wife, you hear one of my cats. Who knows what you're going to hear? But what I can guarantee you are going to hear right now is my conversation with Jono Diener. Enjoy. My guest today is easily the most hyphenated multi-hyphenate that I know. Singer, songwriter, bassist, drummer, freelance writer, comic book writer, social media manager, and chief creative officer of Rootless Coffee. These are just some of the words that you could use to describe my guest today. You could also go with bespectacled, tall, heavily caffeinated, like myself. Jono Diener, welcome to This Is Not My Job. How are you today?
I am good. Thank you for having me.
I won't take any personal umbrage to the pause when I asked you how you were doing. I understand you're tired. You got a lot. I just listed off like 43 things that you do, so I understand if you're a little tired at this time of day.
Yeah, and getting exhausted from hearing my own list of stuff.
Right.
The coffee hasn't fully kicked in. I have my combination of leftover stuff I put together in a mug in my fridge. So that was my morning coffee. I always have like leftover stuff in the pot, and I just keep pouring it in the same mug because I'm an awful person. So yeah, that's what I had this morning.
That's like Franken coffee. Like just like
Yeah.
Is that what entails being a chief creative officer? Is you're just pouring different like coffees into different receptacles and seeing how it tastes 24 hours later?
Yeah, and it's not as much for research as it is for necessity, where I'm like, I got out of bed, I need this now.
I can't wait the 7 to 10 minutes it might take. I don't know how do you prepare your coffee? Are you a drip guy, pour over guy?
I am alternating now between French press and coffee pot. So I used to be pour over guy, and then I just stopped caring. Because I love the ritual of it, but I also just don't have the time to do the ritual of it anymore. So if I'm doing like a French press, for example, I'll like do the day's dishes while the water is heating up in the kettle. And then that process is literally like grind, press the button, wait, Yep. So that one's easy enough for me. And then an awful thing. So my wife, Ashley, as you know,
Yes.
she's like, I want to stop drinking Red Bull and start getting into coffee again. I'm like, yeah, let's go. And then she makes hers at like 6 a.m. and I usually wake up at like 7:30, 8-ish. So I've been eyeing the coffee that's left over in the coffee pot. And I'm like, I could pour that in the mug. I could make that happen. So I'm probably going to do that after this. Just leftovers.
I'm going to chalk that up to years of touring in a van, because you're on the road, in whatever regional gas station. If you're out in Pennsylvania, you're hitting a Sheetz or a Wawa or whatever. It'll make do.
Oh, absolutely. I feel like my palate for life has just been dissolved. It's like years of like sleeping on floors and being like, oh, I found this in my backpack, I'll eat it. So, and then when it comes to coffee too, I've refined my order so many times to where I'll get just espresso on ice. So even if the espresso is not that good, the water will dilute it over time. Or I just get iced coffee because you can't really mess up iced coffee that much.
No.
So I've gotten to the point where I'm like, if I put whatever it is in a fridge, I don't have the expectation of it being good hot coffee. It's just cold whatever. So I'll drink the question mark all day. It's fine.
I like that. That's good advice. Lower your expectations across the board, and you'll never be disappointed.
Exactly.
I'm going currently. Like I've got a little like 5-cup pot, but I like the ritual of the pour over too. And even if I didn't want to go with the pour over, I kind of have to, because Felix, my son, has taken it upon himself to be part of the process now. I've got a burr grinder. He loves to. We get the scale out. We measure our beans. He tears it out. He says 0, 0. I pour the beans in. He pours them in the grinder. He presses the button. He knows the sound of it when the beans are through the grinder. He stops it. He pulls it out. Even if I didn't want coffee, I'm making a cup of coffee.
Oh, that's amazing.
Because that's part of our morning routine. Now, this isn't coffee talk. This is not my job. But if you're listening, you might have gathered that Jono and I know each other, and we do. We are friends IRL. He mentioned his wife Ashley. You were just married in September?
Yes. You
And
remember more than
yeah,
I do.
I,
Because I was last month, right?
so you and I know each other. We're friends. I got your thank you card. Thank you for that. I wanted to touch on the origin story of our personal relationship because it's a story that I love to tell. It was 5 years ago almost now. It was February 2016, and you and I were at the Flint Local 432 in downtown Flint, the venerable local club there, and rock and roll club, not like motorcycle. There's plenty of those.
Or
Oh, night.
nightclub.
Here's a list of clubs: motorcycle, night, Billy, golf. So I was there. I'd been talking to Joel Rash for many years about doing theater in that space, and I don't know why you were there. We've never talked about it. I figured it was personal to you. And then all of a sudden there was this weird scuttlebutt and this weird vibe in the room, and people started like going off into corners and chatting and whatnot. And then all of a sudden somebody was like, hey, you know Macklemore? And we're like, yeah, I know of him. Well, he's going to be here. So the night that you and I met briefly, that was all overshadowed by the fact that Macklemore just decided to show up in Flint. Now, what is your recollection of that evening?
So it's funny for me because I got a tip ahead of time. So I don't know if you ever knew that.
I did not.
Joel. So yep. So Joel was like, and also I found out after that night that it's Macklemore.
Oh, yeah.
So I said Macklemore for, I mean, however long I knew of his existence. But Joel was like, he knew that I was a big proponent of like raising awareness and funds for like Flint water crisis charity related things. And I was also writing for a few publications at the time. And the whole night essentially was like, this is not for the media. This is not for anything. He's just showing up because he wants to actually be in the room and hear actual people from Flint talking about their stories. So Ashley and I went that night. I know you were there. And then was it Stand Up Flint, Rise Up Flint? Natasha Thomas and the group that was there. It was like this awesome inner city program where it was actual kids that were dealing with the Flint water. And it wasn't some like broad strokes like me from the suburb or whatever. Like we just shut up and let them talk, you know? But I just remember him like walking in, and the best was like, I don't listen to him or know much about him, but I knew he was a big deal apparently. So I was never like, whoa, this is the craziest thing. But I was like, this is cool that he chose to do this, you know? Because at that time we were hearing stuff about like Snoop Dogg was randomly taking selfies at like a local high school. And like that's kind of what Flint turned into for a second. It was just like, this is your PR stop, you know? But the cool thing with that meeting was that wasn't the intention. It was, I want to get a taste of what's really going on. And then the next night, I think he played somewhere in Detroit, but he donated like a ton of money. And I believe it was flintkids.org. And at the time, I think we just, timeline wise, I think we already did our water compilation, Not Safe to Drink. So that was 2015, I believe. So that's part of the reason Joel wanted me there. But that was early on when like people were talking about the Community Foundation and the Flint Child Health and Development Fund. And then later they just made the fancy flintkids.org. So that's where everyone started donating, like Beyonce eventually and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that was a very intense experience because it was like, this is real Flint. And then this is the furthest thing from Flint, but someone who could help, you know? And I think for both of us too, it was I think we were starting to see the gravity of the situation from the like world media interest perspective, and also actual people living in Flint and their real stories and not our version of it.
Absolutely. And no, and it was such a crazy, weird night. Like all around, like that was the night that I'd met you. I met Mac Lemore, or Mac Lemore. Yeah, Mac L. And that was also, I had not seen my dear friend Ashley Peacock in many years, and he was there too. The late great Flint musician Ashley Peacock was there, so I got to meet you, reconnect with Ashley, meet Macklemore, see an amazing conversation unfold, and seeing a celebrity actually, like you said, like it was off the record, unbeknownst to anybody. He just showed up and was genuinely listening. And which actually, you bring up an excellent point. That's something else that didn't end up in your hyphenate, was you also are a philanthropist, I guess. Like, I mean, you've spearheaded a lot of projects in order to raise money and awareness for the Flint water crisis, including Not Safe to Drink, and also Hope, or A Comic for Flint, Hope. You might have a different
version.
cover. That's the closest we came to variants with that. That was the anthology comic that you spearheaded back at 2018. That is it's still out there. Actually, at my local comic book shop here in Lansing, Summit Comics still has copies on the shelf. It is great. They have a little like local section there. So
that's awesome.
to kind of move into the meat of the conversation, as you know, this is not my job. We're talking to people who have a job and creative pursuits, but you clearly have taken that to a crazy degree here, because you have your hands in so many things. But I kind of want to back up a little bit and give folks who might not be familiar with you a sort of an origin story. Your journey to where you are now kind of started. I think you were 14 when your first band, the Swellers, started. That you started with your brother Nick. And I know I don't remember the names of the other two gentlemen in the band, but I know that there was some changeover at some point.
Oh, there was plenty of changeover. The very early version was Nick, me, and our friend Nate Lamberts. So it was a 3-piece initially. So when we were 14, the quick Cliff Notes version was my dad's friend growing up was a songwriter for like Hank Williams Jr. And there's a band he put together, or not put together, but managed, called Copperhead. And it was Hank Williams Jr.'s Bama band, essentially. So that guy was so excited that we were in a band, like going for it. So he was like, hey, I want to get together with this producer guy and we'll like work with you on your first 3 songs and like record it in Nashville and blah, blah, blah. So we got like shoved into like, oh, this is real already. Okay. And then we ended up not being very excited with the songs. They were pretty like overproduced, and like they didn't really change anything structure wise or anything. It was just kind of like very loose guiding to what we already were doing. Then we recorded this, or it was a record called End of Discussion with Royce from the Suicide Machines. And it was just really raw and like punky. So we kind of like flipped what we were doing already. And then from there, added another member, and then it just kept changing until 2009. That's where we had like our most known lineup. And that was Anto on bass and then Ryan on guitar.
That Ryan. Thank you. I could not remember the other gentleman's name. So
he's just
Ryan,
silent and handsome Ryan.
Those are the best Ryans, the silent, handsome ones.
Yeah.
So you join the band and things take off. You take a quick jog through the music industry. I say quick jog. I don't want to dismiss that you did this for over a decade.
Yeah. Lots of Taco Bell.
Hey, it's Felix.
Hi.
I might edit this out. I might not. I don't know. He can't hear anything that's going on, so he just hears his dad talking and then some weirdo on the screen. Can you say hi, Jono?
You got to keep that in.
Yeah, he did it. He nailed it. So you do all that, and there's Katie coming to grab him. So
Hi,
you do all that. The joys of pandemic life. So you do all that, and then was it 2014 when the Swellers finally decided to call it?
Yes. Yep. So that's when we announced it, and then we did a short year-long world tour. That was kind of our like, let's milk it while we can tour.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you do all that, and now, and I kind of wanted to lay that out because your story is not like a lot of people. So you did that at 14. You come out in you stopped doing that in 2015, let's call it. Mm-hmm. You're just shy of 30 at that point, I think. And because I think you and my wife are the same age. You're 30, almost 33.
Yeah.
If you don't mind me saying that. If you do, I'll edit this out.
Oh, no, that's fine. I was actually trying to do my own math where I was like, how old was I in 2015? I'm like, you got it.
Yeah. So going from this very interesting lifestyle of a touring working musician to Jono, having to discover who you are outside of that and start supporting yourself in a different way, in a more conventional way. Was that transition jarring for you? And how did you kind of work through that?
So I always, especially now post-band, try and make it very clear that I am a very privileged person. And if it weren't for my parents' support, and that being financial included and letting us live in their house for a bit, we were able to do a lot more with our band than most people were. A lot of people just thought that we were like wildly successful and rich with the band, but I'm like, no, we were just able to like come home and not spend much money. Like our first place after my parents' house, which again, like I forgot whatever year it was, we lived in Flint and the rent was super cheap. And that's kind of, we just like lived off of, we kind of just skimmed. That was like our personal thing. So we made enough to pay rent. And then we were like, we never made enough to make personal money. So we're like, shoot, we should get jobs in between. Meanwhile, Anto and Ryan, actual adults, were already doing that. Anto was an electrician. Ryan was, he's been working at Jet's Pizza for like 14 years. So Nick already had a studio. He could record whenever he wanted. But I was kind of the like, how do I get a job without having a foundation? Because we like started touring not as much. So I was like, well, I guess I'll work at Guitar Center because I'm a musician. And they encouraged that. So that I could be kind of like I'd have drawing power to the drum section and be like, yeah, like I was just on a world tour and now I'm here. You want to buy this $400 drum kit, you know, and I'll get minimum wage. But my thing was like, as long as I have some stability, it's better than nothing. Because, and again, like we were doing fine, but what people don't understand about being a touring musician is there's no retainer. It's not all year. It's 3 or 4 times you get X amount of money, and then there's gaps, and you don't know when the next one's going to happen. So the more that happened, the more we were like, let's ease out. I think it was may have been 2012 or 2013 when I started like actually trying to slowly secure a real resume. So it was, Guitar Center, and then the funny thing, and this is like one story that I really don't share with most people. So when we knew the Swellers were ending, I already started Braided Veins just to like have my own cool outlet and go like crazy with drumming, have like my favorite Flint musicians, like essentially like the Flint super group of like weirdo musicians. But during that process, there were a few potential band situations that almost happened before I fully committed to jobs. So the first one was a Yellow Card, and they were talking to me about potentially being their drummer for the last year. And I was like, okay. So I started like learning their songs, getting ready to go, because they knew that I was technically a free agent at that time. Then that didn't work out. And I was like, okay, whatever. They also announced that actually this is the last year of our band, period. Sorry. So I was like, oh, okay. So that, there was an end date to that as well, if I would have joined. And again, most people won't talk about those opportunities. Then the other one was Bad Religion needed a drummer. So I was able to get an audition for them. I flew to LA, but because I'm Larry David in real life, I booked a flight, and then they were like, oh, we actually can't do it that weekend. What about the next weekend? And I was like, oh, yeah, no worries. Not knowing that there's cancellation fees. And I'm a broke kid, again, working at Guitar Center. So I awkwardly, I was like, would you be able to pay the late fee or the cancellation fee of $200? I asked Bad Religion that, if you're wondering. And they're like,
Bad Religion LLC.
Sure.
Could you cover this, please?
Yeah. Meanwhile, like everyone else, like I thought it was like me and a few other people or something. What I didn't know was like a quintessential LA audition where I show up to this weird like storage space practice facility thing. And I was the very first person to audition as their new drummer. Because like when I had to move it to that next week, I'm like, I'll just go first. I don't care. And then it went well enough. Like I got to play with, it was like Jay Bentley and I believe Brian Baker, who was in like Minor Threat, Circle Jerks, all this like crazy stuff. So I'm already like fanboying out. They were super nice. Brett Gurwitz, the owner of Epitaph Records, comes in, but he's like Simon Cowling and just sitting on a couch with a laptop and like just observing and doing other work, but not playing along. And there were no vocals. So it was like, these are all these extra stressors to me being like, I'm around my heroes. I better not screw this up. Oh my God. So when I was done, I'm like saying bye. start loading my gear out, and I look around the corner, and it's like a line around the block of all like tattooed LA guys. And I'm like this Michigan guy who got like a rental car, like, hey guys, want to play? So I was like, oh, I super did get this. And then the following week, I applied to Starbucks, and that's how I got into coffee. So, and then during that time as well, like, because my thing was I wanted to fill the gaps around touring. So I started taking on more things. And that's kind of how that like freelancer doing too much mentality kicked in. So I was writing for Noisy, which is like part of Vice. And the reason I started doing that is because I did a bunch of like music adjacent blogs and like started building up my own like social media presence and that kind of stuff. So they asked me like, oh, you're like a snarky weirdo. This would be a good fit. So I wrote for Noisy for about a year, and then Alternative Press picked me up. And I was in my head, I was like, I'm going to just be freelance writer guy. Then I realized freelance writer guy doesn't get paid much money unless he's like a staff position. So I can't do that. I have to do this around another job. Then I started Starbucks. Then I went to Foster, which was like a craft coffee company, while I started picking up hired gun drumming. So that's when I did like No Trigger, Early November, all of these other things. So my getting to what I do now, it's always been under the creative umbrella, where it's whether it's storytelling or it's problem solving using storytelling, that kind of started siphoning into like social media, marketing, freelance writing, journalism, and just creating things from scratch. That's kind of what my thing started being. So I finally let myself be okay with, okay, I'm allowed to just say I'm a creative, period. Mm-hmm. So I'm a maker of things. So when it came to Rootless, the newest thing, it was like, well, I love coffee and know a bunch about it. And I also love marketing and know a bunch about it. And I've been in bands and I know how to operate and it's like kind of be scrappy and make an operation work and be able to exist for a long time. So I put all of those together. And then that's how we kind of created that chief creative officer position for Rootless Coffee. Mm-hmm. So then it was, okay, how do I could make all of the things I like and put it into this job and use that as a medium to just kind of, parade around and be like, I could talk to all of my creative friends and do a bunch of cool, weird stuff. And it works to actually sell stuff. It's not just me like gallivanting about. Like there's actually a purpose to these creative things, which is cool.
Yeah. And you touched on something that I wanted to come back to. You mentioned, it was very funny. You demonstrated a cognitive dissonance that can happen to everybody. You talked about music and people not understanding how getting paid as a musician works. And the way you described it is functionally how a freelancer gets paid. So over here, you understand the reality of how you get paid as a musician. But then when you started wanting to freelance writing, for some reason, it just didn't click, but it clearly prepared you for a life as a freelancer because you understood that it goes in fits and starts. And like, sometimes you're drinking from a fire hose and the next minute you're just trying to get dew off the grass to drink. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. But go ahead. But it got to the point where I started realizing that, I thought I could collect a ton of things and make like an adult's amount of work and pay. And then I realized there are jobs that exist that do that. And I don't have to do all the things.
I could work 40 hours or I could work 400 hours and somehow make more time in a week. You also touched on something that I think is very valuable for a lot of people, especially younger creatives, to learn. And that is you took a non-traditional, what I'm going to call a non-traditional educational experience of being a touring musician for over a decade. It would be very easy for somebody to dismiss that and say, you were just a drummer for 10 years. What do you know? But you, like you just said, like being in that band and learning to exist in that paradigm prepared you to do stuff like be a freelancer, to start a coffee company, to be able to subsist in that world. And I feel like a lot of creatives don't understand that just because you got this skill playing music that you can't apply it in the quote unquote real world. So I think your experience in doing that is very valuable.
Yeah. And for me, there were so many parts of being in a band. So it wasn't just the drummer, which, is like this obvious surface level version of it. I was a social media manager. I ran all of our accounts. I was dealing with, at the time, like major label executives and like A&R people and product managers. So I was like, oh, so this is technically like a corporate job, but I'm just doing it through the lens of being in a band. And then there's like merchandise manager, product manager working with designers to get stuff done. And I was like, I was doing like 50, like I wore 50 hats and was the drummer of the band, you know, in addition to songwriting, in addition to whatever. So there's like the creative and the business marriage that are in that, I guess in that sphere of being a musician. And then, yeah, like for me, I had like hands-on experience. I was physically traveling to all these places, shaking hands with people, talking to them face to face and networking. Like that was my job. I didn't go to a second of college. Whereas a lot of my friends would get like a music business degree or a communications degree or a business management degree and then end up working with me at Starbucks, you know? So like we all kind of ended in the same spot. But then it was like, okay, so how do you use this to your advantage? And mine was, I have this ridiculous life experience. And that wasn't the plan. The plan was to be in a band forever. And one day I was like, I want to play arenas like Foo Fighters and like, that's my life. And I just kept to travel and do whatever. And then it changed to like, being home's so much easier than traveling. and like, as the strange silver lining of like being forced to be home was like, I got to like trip into adulthood without realizing it. And not saying that being a musician isn't being adult, but the stuff I love is like the stuff where I get to finally sit down and focus on it and create and make and, you know, be this like administrative thing that I've always actually enjoyed doing without having to drive 8 hours sitting in a smelly fart-filled van and load my heavy drums and screw my back up more than it's already screwed. So like it kind of relieved all of this unnecessary stress that I didn't realize I had. But meanwhile, I'm stubborn and love touring and love playing shows, but I get to apply that energy. And instead of the 30 minutes a day payoff, I get a lot more of that.
Right. And so that leads me right into your newest, and I shouldn't say newest endeavor, but a new endeavor for you. Obviously, Rootless is the newest endeavor, but right around 2017, 2018, I'm guessing, is when the idea popped into your head that you would start writing comics. So I feel like there's probably a lot of parallels between music and specifically the industry of music and the industry of comics. How valuable was your experience in the music industry in allowing you to, because it felt like all of a sudden you were writing little stories and we did Hope, and then all of a sudden you've got stuff out there. So you have that because you have that maker's mentality. Your time in the music industry, how did that sort of prepare you to jump right into comics and just start making headway immediately?
For me, I think a lot of it was the mentality of if you want to make something, you have to start making something and cross that threshold. So like when we did Hope, for example, all of us always talked about wanting to make comics, and then none of us were making comics. And I went, I'm making this a project, just like I did that like music compilation where it's like, I wish I could raise money for charity and not spend a dime. Let's have everyone chip in and then raise a ton of money. So I used the incentive of charity, got all of us together. We all paired each other up. And then that's how all of us got our first comic done. So there was a deadline. It was just product management 101, you know? Yeah. This is how you put this stuff together. But the reason I was able to do that and had a, fundamental understanding of comic writing was because I was working with artists all the time. So it was album artwork, t-shirt designs. What do you want to do? What are you excited about? How do we make this work? So by doing that, that's how I started working with Craig Horkey, because he was doing Swellers designs. Mm-hmm. And then he started doing like braided veins, like show posters. And then I got to the point where I was like, this is a weird pitch, but would you ever want to do a comic? And he's like, my dream was to be a comic artist. I'm like, well, I didn't know that. So that's crazy, like happenstance, you know? But that's kind of how the stuff works, where it's like, I never pressured anyone into doing things. It was always, I have an idea. Do you want to go on the ride with me? Yeah. And so, you know, Hope was a good launching point for all of us to like kind of get in that world. But for me, as far as like being able to make stuff and network and whatever, that was just like the same as like being in a band, going to shows, doing whatever. So both of you and I went to Heroes Con in North Carolina. And that for me was like a business trip where I was like, I want to make FaceTime with people I really like in the industry and people I don't know, but I know would be like a valuable person to be friends with. So one of those people, first of all, I already knew Liana because we were working on a pitch in the past, whatever, and Liana Kangas for listeners. And it got to the point where I finally met her in person. We were hanging out. Then she introduced me to Matt Emmons, who I would later not only do a comic with, Monster Bounty, which we got to release at C2E2, but he got to work with me at Rootless Coffee. Yes. Because I started taking, I like the idea of my brain having a Rolodex of creatives for anything I do. So now it's no longer just comics. It's how do I tie that into the coffee business? The new marketing agency I worked at, how do I throw them work for other clients? Maybe it's like an investment firm, but they want like an illustration, you know? Mm-hmm. So I think that's how, in a sane way, I'm able to like handle juggling all the stuff, because I think right now, my number one thing is just getting to be creative and tell stories, period. Whether it's music, whether it's comics, whether it's whatever. If I had a career choice right now, it would be professional comic writer. Right. Full time. If I was able to do that. But I've run into so many people that are very headstrong about like, I want to do this thing. And you know what? I'm not going to let anything get in my way. And then they do it in a really unrealistic and stubborn way that starts killing their own morale. Whereas, as you said, like, you know, in 2016 or 2017, whenever it was, when I started like thinking about actually doing comics, which again is like a very short amount of time in like the comic sphere. Normally it's like 10 years for like people to like even get a thing or something. And the reason I kind of went in for it is because I created an infrastructure around that. So I know I'm getting paid enough to exist. I know I could throw money to an artist if I need to. And I have my day job, which is, you know, the point of the podcast. And how do I get to not be burnt out by the end of that to do my creative stuff? So I think that's all really like important for creatives too, like younger comic writers, younger musicians, whatever. There's the risk reward scenario where how do I set myself up in a smart way to be able to do the things I love and make them last rather than have a short controlled burst and then it just disappears.
Yeah, and that's great. And I remember it was 2019 when we went to North Carolina, and I was doing the same thing. Like we had that business trip mentality. That was supposed to be on my 2020 C2E2. We were all there. You tabled with Matt Emmons. I was there with my business cards trying to pick up primarily editorial at that time. And I was going to go to TCAF, Toronto Comic and Arts Festival. I was going to go back to Heroes Con. I was going to go to Motor City. That was the year I was going to really start pushing for editorial stuff. And 2020 took that all away. But you touched on something that I relate to, like you were talking about, like just making things. And that was the struggle that I was going through, was overcoming the anxiety and the stress of, like, my anxiety is being judged and criticized by the artists or the editor, like anybody that I hand my work off to. Which is why I like making personal things that only I can touch and deal with. So having been in that music background and being part of a collaborative, like you're one of 4, or in the case of a comic, you're one of 2 or more, depending on who's publishing it. You've got letters and inkers and colorists and et cetera. How do you fight through that? Like, how do you best prepare your mind for collaborative work, which I think is important for people, not just in a creative field, but just in day-to-day life and effectively working in groups?
So the first real collaborative thing was my brother and I writing songs. And we learned very quickly that our method was 2 people are the songwriters and then other people can add like spice on top. But they don't touch the foundation. So that was our agreement. And that's what worked for the Swellers specifically. As time went on, I would, again, it's the product manager standpoint where how do I feel out the situation? Whose opinion am I listening to? Whose is beneficial, all that. But what really kicked my ass was writing for Noisy, writing for Alternative Press, and having actual editors. And it wasn't just like, I'm fixing your grammar. It was, here's the structure. This doesn't make sense. Flesh this out. Why are you doing this? And at first, like anyone, I was really upset when I would get notes. And I'm like, dude, I thought I did a good job. What the hell? And then I realized their job is that. Their job is to go, I am reading this as a reader, make this better for me. Because the point of anything is to get things read, to get things listened to. It's the same with producers. Like the second to last Swellers full length, we got to record with Bill Stevenson of Descendants at the Blasting Room. And him and Jason Livermore, the other producer, are like the first time we ever worked with a real producer in our lives. And we respected them so much that we shut the hell up and let them do whatever. And the thing is, you have to have a good idea to begin with for people to work with you. Then you refine that idea. And similar to a song, you do what's best for the song. You don't do what's best for your ego. So when I would turn things in, whether it's like an anthology script, so like maybe someday, or everything is going wrong or whatever, I go into it knowing that my stuff is about to be torn apart and I'm okay with it. Just like I would go to get a tattoo and I don't give them a 5-paragraph essay about what I want the tattoo to be. I go, I want a skull and a feather. And they go, cool, I'll make it work. And I chose them because I know that the result will be good. Mm-hmm. And that's what it comes down to. It's about trust and it's about understanding. Mm-hmm. So if you're going into comics with a mentality of, no, my way, it's my way or the highway, you're in the wrong business. Mm-hmm. But if you're going there knowing I'm working with an editor I respect and I know whatever's going to happen is going to be different, like whether it's like my friend Fabian did the layouts for the Inevitables and he crushed it. And I was just like, this is exactly what I wanted because I knew you are good at this. Mm-hmm. And then Liana doing colors and like the inks and like all of this stuff. I try and make sure I have the people on my team for a reason. Mm-hmm. And if there's someone who's like fighting for their way and it's clashing with the goal, then that's a problem. So my thing is I've now submitted to good criticism, mm-hmm. where like I want to be torn apart for things, but only by the people I'm choosing to be torn apart by, if it's their job. Yes. So if it's like a friend reaching out like, hey man, can I give you some advice, blah, blah, blah. And I would politely go, I don't think that's a good idea. But if it's like a user experience for like Rootless coffee, for example, a lot of people reached out and they're like, hey, it'd be cool if you did this and blah, blah, blah. And there's certain people where I'm like, that guy owns a business and he's like, oh, the postcard can be souped up and that can be a better thing. Or the type of bag or the what, like there's things like that. But then there's other people where they're critiquing from a subjective standpoint to where it's like, I think this coffee, your light roast would be better if it was darker. I'm like, well, that doesn't make sense. And that's like real criticism that people have where it's like, I like a bold roast. I'm like, okay, well, we have that. That's different. That's a different thing. Or your expectation is set for whatever. But if it were like a comic script, for example, like I haven't had like an editor on a full series or anything yet. I also haven't done a full series yet that's like been published or anything. Yeah. So I'm going into that excited about someone ripping my stuff apart and giving me guidance and not being like, oh, I have to do extra work now, or I have to redo this. Like that's the point, And I think so many people are precious of things when they shouldn't be precious, because the point of collaboration is to make something better, not just something different.
Yeah. Well, message received. I'll stop sending you daily unsolicited advice text messages. I won't do that anymore. You mentioned Maybe Someday, which is the new anthology that was recently released by A Wave Blue World. Kind of walk us through how that happened in terms of getting hooked up with that anthology. And for the folks listening who might not be as familiar with the world of comics, kind of speak to, because I speak to the value of anthologies as somebody trying to advance their career, because I think they're an invaluable tool for everybody involved.
The benefit of anthologies for a comic creator, it's essentially it's a quick bite and a taste of what you do. So it's not only easier to create and finish, and finishing is the most important part of comics, because you could tweak and never get anything done, and then no one ever sees it, and then essentially you don't exist. So with anthologies, it's a way of it's your sampler platter, like, okay, so Rootless, for example, has like are 4 roasts you could try. And you might not like all of them, but you might love one of them, and then you stick with that one. It's the same with music compilations. There's a reason that people, they want a choice. And it's also a great way to like sneak into people's, I guess, just like their world. So if I'm reading an anthology because I know Jeff Lemire is in it, I'm like, oh man, this is great. Maybe the next one is an art or a writer or an artist I've never heard of, but I really like their stuff, and it stops me. Mm-hmm. So it catches my personal taste. Then I look them up on Twitter and I go, oh, I'm going to follow that person. And then like in a month, maybe they release a new thing on like Aftershock or TKO or some other publisher. I'm like, oh yeah, that was actually pretty cool. And then I buy that stuff, and then they've won me. Mm-hmm. So that's the point of anthologies, where, it's not as much work. It's able to get your name out in a lot of places, and you're then attached to all of these other people, which is important. So depending on what it is, there's a sense of camaraderie. You get to be like, hey, we're in this thing together. You share that. And most importantly, I was finally able to get a physical product. Mm-hmm. So when we did Hope, a comic for Flint / a comic for Flint Hope, depending on where you get it, which is still the funniest thing to me. Like, I love that it adds a sense of validity to what you do, you know? Mm-hmm. So like having it, like web comics is a big deal. Like I have a site with I think I have 8 on mine now. Mm-hmm. And the point is to say I'm actively and actually making stuff. Mm-hmm. Whereas a lot of people, I think I heard like Alec Baldwin talking about it it was like Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, where he's like, no one has ever gotten picked up because they had an idea. They got it because they told someone the idea. Mm-hmm. And like there's no secret editor that's just like, you know what, Carl seems like a cool dude based on his Twitter. but if you sent them a bunch of stuff, they would go, this guy gets it. Like I see him improving. I see him doing this, you know? And that's what I've gone into, because I've been burned so many times in music and so many other things, but that's part of it. It's not like failure isn't the whole goal, but the idea of failure, again, with heavy quotes, because it's a podcast and you can't see me using my fingers, mm-hmm. That is just showing people like I'm trying and I'm getting better and I'm going to keep getting better. Because if you don't improve and you don't adjust, then you just stay not good.
Yeah.
And
you mentioned having a physical product and like that benefit of success. And I'm not sure when in the order. I'm recording multiple episodes to kind of start off strong. But yesterday I spoke with Stephanie Cook. And she talked about like in terms of like interacting with coworkers and just people in general, like people don't really take you seriously until you have a physical product. And like she said, like literally people were like saying to her, oh, I didn't realize it was a real book. Like people, when you tell people who aren't involved in creative pursuits that you're creating things, having that physical, tangible product is like the ultimate, trump card on that. Like, you made a thing. I thought you just published them on a website that I wasn't going to look at, but no, I can go buy this in a store with money. Like the value of that is immense. Let's see here. This is one that I struggle with personally, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on it as well. As a musician, as a writer, in those two specific veins, I come from a theater background. I have a hard time just being able to go to a show and enjoy it, because I struggle with turning off the professional side of me that, has been in dozens of productions and directed and done everything that you can do on a show. Do you ever struggle with just reading a comic or just listening to a song and not going, oh, I wouldn't have done that. Why'd they do that? Oh, the mic was a little hot on that hi-hat. Like, are you able to easily just sort of enjoy these things without turning critical?
Because I've done these things for so long, I tend to gravitate toward things I know I will genuinely like and avoid things I know I probably won't like. Mm-hmm. So especially with music, I'm very, very, very picky. But if I can have something that like resonates with me on like an emotional level and it actually gets through my like cold, dead heart, then I'm like, oh, this is very important to me now. So like Phoebe Bridgers is one of those where I'm like, there's just something there that like it hits all of the right notes. It's just like sarcastic and snarky, but dark and deep and heartfelt and just well produced. Like that will do a lot more for me. But as I get older and having been in like, I guess a good metaphor for everything would be, I would always play in bands, specifically Swellers for this, where we would have different phases of the music scene. So it would be the opening bands would all sound like this. And then like 2 years later, they'd all sound like that. So like it was Christian metalcore for 2 years. Every show we played was always like an Under Oath wannabe band. And then all of them suddenly wanted to be like 4 Years Strong and have like breakdowns and pop punk. And then everyone wanted to sound like the Wonder Years. And then so I would be able to pinpoint, I know exactly which band you're trying to replicate, and like good for you. And I get it. But I had my version of that. Meanwhile, the guys in Braided Veins who are in their 40s have their versions of the bands I like, and so on, So I'm very understanding of it being like subjective when it comes to music and art and comics and whatever. But I could very quickly tell if I'm going to really enjoy something or not.
Mm-hmm.
There are some comics that I read where I'm like, I'm going to finish this, but I'm not going to keep up with it. But then there's other ones where it's like, I'm on a huge Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips kick again.
Mm-hmm.
So I just read Pulp and I'm finishing Reckless now,
Mm-hmm.
Or vice versa. And I know what I'm getting into. I'm like, this is going to be well done. It's going to look great. And it's going to just be an odd crime story in one way or another.
Yep.
Then there's other ones I read. And like I've noticed, like for me specifically with like certain fantasy stories, it's just like when there's like confusing names and there's like the writing is trying to explain so much but not be natural. Like that's how my brain picks apart stuff, because I'm like a sucker for dialogue, like good dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's like explanatory monologues and like stuff like that, where I'm like, you're just trying to like tuck this stuff in because you have one issue to work with. Yep. And I don't care about like Draconius going to the Balthazar stone. You know, yep. I'm just like, I don't care. But if it's two people in a room having a good conversation, I'll read that shit all day.
Yeah.
You know? So it's all based on my taste, where like I have like my John-ometer where I'm like, I know I'm going to like this or not, you know?
The John-o-meter.
Yeah.
You touched on something there. You mentioned Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, and it kind of ties into something I wanted to talk to you about vis-a-vis the Swellers. For those of you who don't know, Ed Brubaker is a comic book writer primarily known for writing really great crime comics, and Sean Phillips is a frequent artistic collaborator. You, in an interview I read with you, you talked about feeling like the early Swellers fans felt kind of alienated as your sound evolved, and how like if you picked up like all of a sudden if Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips decided to do a space western or just like a slice of life romantic comedy book, I think a lot of people would probably be a little turned off by that. Having gone through that once before with feeling that sort of disconnect with fans with the Swellers, do you ever feel that concern with comics or the music that you've continued to make with your solo project Baggage? Like, do you worry about that kind of rearing its head again and building those new set of expectations only to let a new set of people, quote unquote, down?
I think I thought about this a lot in the last few years. I've matured enough to understand the concept of expectation, mm-hmm. especially with art. So with Swellers, within that, there were like several eras of people being into it, people getting out, people coming in. So like we started as like little no effects, super fast punk rock ripoff, or No Use for a Name more specifically, that was the band. Then we got into bands like a Wilhelm Scream and got a little bit of a harder edge. And then we were like, but we also like Foo Fighters, let's go super, like, so, you know, we've watched the waves of that like crash in different ways. And then when it came to like, I mean, for me with comics, like no one knows me yet. So I'm very like, self-aware of that. I'm like the weird guy on Twitter who like has stuff showing up in other things and people are like, oh, that's pretty good. Or they just didn't read it at all. So I am using this time, just like I did with Baggage, to like develop my voice while people aren't paying attention. Mm-hmm. And I'm using that to my advantage, unlike a lot of people who are like upset that it didn't pan out or whatever. So a good example would be Braided Veins happening while the Swellers were ending. And people are like, what the hell is this? And it was awesome for me, because what people didn't know is like the music I listened to, I didn't listen to like fast pop punk or whatever. Like that's why like our later stuff was like more like emotional and like hit on like a few notes of these certain bands. But then the other side of the stuff I listened to was like the band Mets, Drive Like Jehu, Refuse, The Bronx, like heavier, weirder stuff. So when I finally got to let that out, I remember we played Braided Veins open for the band Into It Over It. Mm-hmm. And they saw me like loading my drums and people were like, oh man, like this is gonna be like this new pop punk or emo thing or whatever. And then we did this like super weird punk hardcore stuff. And like we ended and everyone's head was tilted and it was like a 5-second pause. And then you just start hearing, and we were like, yes, like we like screwed with their brains. This is awesome. So that's the kind of stuff where I like messing with people's expectations. And I feel like, so with the Brubaker and Sean Phillips reference, I guess, or whatever, like I feel if you do it well and you're good at what you do, you're able to move around. Mm-hmm. Like you have enough, you've created enough parameters and wiggle room for yourself to make good, different stuff. Yeah. So to like loosely put it in perspective, like with comics for me, I have like 2 like horror sci-fi kind of things I'm working on. One is like a crime comic, and then The Inevitables is just like a weird like ground level team up thing. So like I kind of found the style of characters I like that all kind of fit in those molds, but genre-wise, it could totally change.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I personally love, where it's like, I would love to do, I'm super weird for this, but Shocker is one of my favorite Spider-Man villains of all time, like just since I was a little kid. So like, I know exactly what I would do for a Shocker series, like a standalone series. But then on the other side, if it was like, hey, we want you to do like the Archies, like in a band for Archie Comics, I'd be like, oh yeah, in a second. Yeah. And the thing is, I know how to like pivot my brain to do that stuff, just because in my personal background, I've done so many different types of things. But when it comes to storytelling, like I know how to follow the foundation and then add the Jono elements throughout that.
Yeah. Well, then that would actually go really well. Like I would love to do a Paste Pot Pete series, and then they could team up and take on Spider-Man. And then maybe we could get, I'm just trying to think like of all the people, like I don't really like Paste Pot Pete. He was just the first obscure villain. I'm a big fan of David Harper, who does Sketched and Off Panel and everything. And he loves Stiltman so much. And so I really want somebody to like really do a Stiltman story for David. And so now I know like you have the Shocker thing. I know like, if somebody just did that one great Shocker story, it could be me. I think that would be great. As we sort of kind of approach the end here, there's one question that I was really curious is, you talked about developing an ability to market not just yourself, but anything that you come into contact with. But you also traffic in art, which a lot of people value, like authenticity and a genuine voice. How, as somebody who wants to tell these authentic stories, but also needs to market them, because in comic books, sometimes you got to market yourself. How do you straddle that line between marketing and promoting, but doing so in a genuine and authentic way that doesn't feel like you're just asking people to give you money in exchange for something you made?
I think first it's just actually being passionate about something. So like having heart kind of leak into your words when it comes to like promotions and that kind of stuff. I've also learned the value of like very simple things like a call to action, like say whatever the hell you want and then say, order it here, buy it now. Check this out, like, because you have to direct people, but you have to tell the story to lead them to direct them somewhere. Mm-hmm. But, it's been tiresome for years because I've never had people to do it for me. So I've always been my own hype man for everything. And when you're doing, again, like 5 or 6 different things, it sometimes like slips through the cracks and people don't really pay attention to what those things are. So my main outlook is if it's promoting myself, I have a very easy gauge of my own voice. So this is how I promote things. If it's for someone else, like the new ad agency I'm working for, it's see what they work or see what they do and then be a chameleon for them and speak as if you're writing a character, So like I'm writing Steve, the investment guy. This is how he would talk.
The breakout character of 2021, Steve.
Steve, the investment guy.
Sorry.
But yeah, so no, you're good. Him and Shocker have a big feud. It's going to be great.
And Steve just invests his way out of the situation. He just hits on a stock, makes a bunch of money, and just pays the Shocker to go away.
Yeah. It's like, I hit it big on Bitcoin, so see you later, Shocker. Bought a missile.
It's very, very Squirrel Girl of you to just, think your way through the problem as opposed to just punching your way out of the problem.
Exactly.
If you guys if you haven't read Squirrel Girl, go read Ryan North and Eric Anderson's Squirrel Girl. It's great.
That's so good.
It really is. Jono, I called you John. I don't know why I called you John. Like, who does anybody call you John?
People I'm not close friends with do.
That's how you know. Well, yeah, I just gave it away, folks. Spoiler alert. I don't really know Jono, but I'm a heck of an actor. Jonathan Diener, thank you for joining me today. For anybody who wants to check out any of his comics that he's got currently available, you can go to his website, www.jonodiener.com. If you want a good cup of coffee, rootlesscoffee.com. Is there any other .coms that I'm missing?
No, that's fine. Those work.
All right, cool. Well, Jono, thank you for joining me. Talk to you soon.
Love you. Bye.
Love you. And there you have it. The first episode of This Is Not My Job is in the books. I would like to thank my guest, Jono Diener, for joining me today. Go to his website. Go to Rootless Coffee's website. Check both of those out. You can check Jono out on Twitter, @Jono Diener. You can follow me, @BigCityZero on Twitter. You can also follow the show, @NotMyJobPod. That'll be the first place that any announcements about the show come up. The music that you're hearing right now, the music you've heard throughout the entire episode, comes courtesy of Jim Hall. The song is called The Dust Clears, and it comes from his album, The Mishmash EP, which you can find at both his Bandcamp and SoundCloud pages. And thank you for sticking around this far, for listening to the episode. I hope that you found it entertaining and enriching and educational. The 3 E's of podcasting, as literally no one says. If you enjoyed the podcast, please recommend it to your friends, your family, your coworkers, neighbors. I think the show will do really well with neighbors. If you didn't like the podcast, recommend it to your enemies. It'd be a good way to get a little petty revenge for whatever slights, perceived or otherwise, they have enacted upon you. So I intend to release these every 2 weeks for right now, and I don't foresee any reason why that should not happen. But until next time, thank you so much for listening. I cannot tell you enough how much I appreciate it. Take care, and bye-bye.